The ring was silver and old, its crest worn nearly smooth, and Fenna Larek had carried it for 3 days because anything bearing a family seal deserved to go home. She stood at the edge of a property where apple trees stretched in orderly rows, their branches heavy with late summer fruit, and beyond them rose wooden boxes painted white, each one humming with the industrious drone of bees. The cottage at the center was small, built of fieldstone and timber, with a porch that looked like it had been added as an afterthought but had settled into the landscape, as though it had always belonged. Smoke curled from the chimney, carrying the scent of bread and herbs, and Fenna adjusted the worn pack on her shoulders before walking up the dirt path that wound between the hives. She had found the ring on a mountain trail 2 weeks past, half buried in the mud after a storm had washed the earth away from the roots of an old pine. The crest had been difficult to raid, but she had taken it to a jeweler in the last town she passed through, and he had squinted at it through his lens and told her it belonged to the Oaks family, minor gentry from the Southern Valley, and that there was a younger son who had left the estate years ago to keep bees somewhere in the foothills. He had drawn her a rough map, told her she was a fool to go out of her way for a trinket, and she had thanked him and walked out into the rain. Fenna was used to being called a fool. Orcs generally were, by humans who thought them good only for labor or violence, but she had spent most of her 24 years proving that neither assessment was the whole truth. She was tall but not towering, built strong from a childhood spent hauling timber and stone, and her green skin was darker than some, lighter than others, marked with old scars from work and weather. Her tusks were small, barely protruding past her lower lip, and she kept her black hair braided back in a practical plait that hung to the middle of her back. She wore traveling clothes, leather and wool, all of it mended more than once, and she moved with the steady gait of someone who had walked a long way and did not mind walking further. The door to the cottage opened before she reached it, and a man stepped out onto the porch, wiping his hands on a cloth. He was human, perhaps 30, with brown hair that fell just past his ears and hazel eyes that held a cautious curiosity. He wore a simple shirt with the sleeves rolled to his elbows, trousers tucked into worn boots, and there was flour dusted across his forearms. He was not particularly tall, perhaps just shy of 6 feet, and his build was lean in the way of men who worked steadily but did not labor under heavy loads. There was something quiet about him, something that made Fenna think of deep water or old trees, and when he looked at her, he did not flinch. "Can I help you?" His voice was low, calm, and he folded the cloth in his hands with deliberate care. Fenna stopped at the base of the porch steps and reached into the pouch at her belt, drawing out the ring. She held it up so he could see it, the silver catching the afternoon light. "I found this on a trail 2 weeks north of here. The jeweler in Marston said it might belong to you. The crest is an oak tree, and your name is Oaks, so I thought I would bring it and see." The man stared at the ring, and something shifted in his expression, a flicker of surprise followed by something deeper, something that looked like recognition mixed with old grief. He descended the steps slowly, crossing the distance between them, and reached out to take the ring from her palm. His fingers brushed hers briefly, calloused and warm, and he turned the ring over in his hand, running his thumb across the worn crest. "I lost this 4 years ago," he said quietly. "I thought it was gone forever." He looked up at her, his hazel eyes searching her face as though trying to understand why she was standing in front of him. "You walked all this way to return it. It seemed like the right thing to do," Fenna said simply. "Something with a family seal is important. I would want someone to return it to me." He was silent for a long moment, still holding the ring, still looking at her with that same bewildered expression. Then he glanced back at the cottage, at the open door and the warm light spilling out, and when he turned back to her, he spoke before he seemed to have thought it through. "Would you stay for dinner?" Fenna blinked. "What dinner?" He gestured toward the cottage a little awkwardly, as though he had surprised himself. "I was just making bread, and there is stew on the fire. You walked a long way. It seems like the least I can do." She had expected thanks, perhaps a small reward, though she had not come for one. She had not expected an invitation, and certainly not one delivered with such earnest uncertainty. "You do not have to do that, I know." He slipped the ring onto his right hand, where it settled into place as though it had never left. "But I would like to, if you are willing." Fenna studied him, this quiet man with flour on his arms and bees humming in the background, and found that she was curious. "All right," she said. "Thank you." He smiled then, a small expression that softened the lines of his face. "I am Henry Oakes, Fenna Larek. Come inside, Fenna." He turned and climbed the steps, holding the door open for her. The bread should be ready soon. The interior of the cottage was as tidy as the exterior, with whitewashed walls and wooden beams across the ceiling. There was a large hearth on one wall, a fire burning steadily beneath an iron pot that bubbled with something savory. A table stood near the window, set with simple dishes, and shelves lined the walls, filled with jars of honey in varying shades of gold and amber. The air smelled of yeast and herbs, of wood smoke and beeswax, and Fenna felt something in her chest ease at the warmth of it. Henry gestured toward the table. "Sit, please. I will get the bread out." She set her pack down by the door and took a seat, watching as he moved to the hearth and used a cloth to lift a covered pot from the coals. He set it on the stone counter and removed the lid, revealing a round loaf with a golden crust that crackled faintly as the steam escaped. He let it cool for a moment, then sliced it with a practiced hand and brought the slices to the table on a wooden board. He ladled stew into 2 bowls, thick with vegetables and chunks of meat, and set one in front of her before taking his own seat across the table. "This is more than I expected," Fenna said, looking at the spread. "I do not often have company," Henry admitted. "It is nice to have someone to share a meal with." They ate in companionable silence for a few minutes, the stew rich and warming, the bread soft on the inside with a crust that had just enough give. Fenna had been on the road for weeks, eating dried meat and hard cheese, and the simple comfort of a hot meal in a warm kitchen made her realize how much she had missed it. "How did you find me?" Henry asked eventually, breaking the quiet. "The jeweler in Marston recognized the crest," Fenna said. "He told me about the Oakes family and that one of the sons had left to keep bees in the foothills. He drew me a map. It took a few days, but I asked at farms along the way, and people pointed me in the right direction." Henry shook his head slowly. "That is a long way to walk for a ring." "It is just walking," Fenna said. "I was heading south anyway. It was not so far out of my way. Still." He looked down at the ring on his finger, turning it slightly. "Most people would not have bothered, especially not for someone they did not know." "Most people are not orcs," Fenna said, a hint of wryness in her tone. "We are used to working hard for small rewards." Henry looked at her sharply, and she wondered if she had offended him, but his expression was thoughtful rather than angry. "That should not be the way of things." "No," Fenna agreed, "but it is." He was quiet for a moment, then reached for the bread and tore off another piece. "Where are you heading, if you were traveling south anyway?" "I am looking for work," Fenna said. "I have been moving from place to place for the past year, taking jobs where I can find them. Timber cutting, stone hauling, farm labor. I am strong and I am willing, and that is usually enough." "That sounds like a hard life." "It is the life I have." She met his eyes across the table. "I do not mind it. I like moving, seeing new places. I do not have anyone waiting for me anywhere, so there is no reason to stay put. Henry nodded slowly as though he understood that. I know what that is like. I left my family years ago, came out here to start over. Why? The question was out before she could stop it, and she winced. I am sorry, that is none of my business. It is all right. He set the bread down and leaned back in his chair, his gaze distant. My father had plans for me, plans I did not want. He wanted me to marry a woman I did not love, to take over part of the estate, to live a life that felt like it belonged to someone else. So I left. I took what I could carry, walked until I found this place, and started keeping bees. It has been 4 years, and I have not gone back. Do you miss it? Fenna asked. Sometimes, Henry admitted. I miss my sister, but I do not miss the expectations, the weight of being who they wanted me to be instead of who I am. Out here I can just be Henry. I can tend the bees, grow apples, bake bread, and no one tells me it is not enough. Fenna understood that more than she could say. She had left her own clan for similar reasons, though her departure had been less about expectations and more about the desire to see what lay beyond the familiar. It sounds like you found what you were looking for. I think I did, Henry said. He looked at her then, really looked, and there was something in his gaze that made her feel seen in a way she was not used to. Thank you for bringing the ring back. It means more than you know. I am glad I could return it, Fenna said honestly. They finished the meal, and Henry insisted on packing food for her journey, wrapping bread and cheese in cloth and tucking a jar of honey into her pack, despite her protests. He walked her to the door as the sun began to dip toward the horizon, painting the orchard in shades of gold and amber, and when she turned to thank him again, he spoke first. If you are ever back this way, he said, a little hesitantly, you are welcome to stop by, for dinner or just to rest. I meant what I said. I do not often have company, and I enjoyed talking to you. Fenna felt warmth spread through her chest, something that had nothing to do with the meal. I will remember that. She left as the evening deepened, walking back down the path between the hives, and when she glanced over her shoulder, Henry was still standing on the porch, watching her go. She raised a hand in farewell, and he returned the gesture, and then she turned her face south and kept walking. But she thought about the cottage, about the quiet man with the kind eyes and the bees humming in the background, and she found herself wondering if she might take him up on that invitation someday. 3 weeks later, Fenna found herself on the same road, heading north instead of south. She had taken work on a farm 2 valleys over, helping to bring in the harvest, and when the work was done and she was paid, she had looked at the map the jeweler had drawn and thought about warm bread, and the way Henry had smiled when she agreed to stay for dinner. It would not be so far out of her way to stop by, she told herself. Just to say hello, just to see if he meant what he said. The orchard looked different in the early autumn light, the apples ripe and ready for picking, the leaves on the trees beginning to turn gold at the edges. The cottage was the same, solid and welcoming, and when she knocked on the door, it opened almost immediately. Henry stood in the doorway, his hair slightly damp as though he had just washed, and when he saw her, his face lit up with unmistakable pleasure. Fenna. Hello, she said, suddenly uncertain. I was passing through and I thought I would see if your offer still stood. Of course it does. He stepped back, holding the door wide. Come in. I was just about to make supper. She stepped inside, the warmth and the familiar smells wrapping around her like a welcome, and Henry closed the door behind her, his smile still in place. I am glad you came back. So am I, Fenna said, and she meant it. Dinner that night was roasted chicken with herbs from his garden, potatoes cooked in the coals, and fresh bread with butter and honey. They talked as they ate, the conversation flowing more easily than it had the first time, and Fenna found herself laughing at a story Henry told about a swarm of bees that had decided to relocate to his bedroom window. He laughed too, the sound low and genuine, and she realized she liked the way his eyes crinkled at the corners when he was amused. "How was the harvest work?" Henry asked, refilling her cup with cider from a jug. "Hard," Fenna said, "but good. The family was fair and the pay was decent. I stayed in their barn and helped with everything from threshing to mending fences. They did not care that I was an orc, only that I could do the work." "That is how it should be," Henry said firmly. "But it is not always," Fenna reminded him. "I have been turned away from more places than I have been welcomed. Some people see the tusks and the green skin and decide they know everything about me before I open my mouth." Henry frowned, his expression troubled. "I am sorry, that is wrong." "It is what it is," Fenna said with a shrug. "I stopped letting it hurt a long time ago. I just keep moving." "Is that what you want?" Henry asked quietly. "To keep moving," Fenna paused, her cup halfway to her lips. It was a question she had not let herself think about too much, because the answer was complicated. "I do not know," she said finally. "I like the freedom of it, not being tied to one place, but sometimes I wonder what it would be like to stay somewhere long enough to build something instead of always passing through." Henry nodded, his gaze thoughtful. "I felt like that before I came here. Like I was always moving towards something but never arriving. It took me a long time to realize that I had to stop and build what I wanted, instead of waiting for it to appear." "And you did," Fenna said. "This place, the orchard, the bees, it is yours." "It is," Henry agreed, "and it is enough." They sat in comfortable silence after that, the fire crackling softly in the hearth. And when Fenna finally said she should go, Henry offered her the loft to sleep in rather than making her walk in the dark. She accepted, grateful, and climbed the narrow ladder to the small space under the eaves, where a bed was made up with clean linens and a quilt that smelled of lavender. She lay awake for a while, listening to the quiet sounds of the cottage settling, and thought about what it might be like to stay in one place long enough to call it home. The next morning, Henry made breakfast, eggs and fried bread with slices of apple, and they ate together at the table as the sun rose over the orchard. Fenna helped him collect honey from the hives afterward, wearing a veil he provided and marveling at the way the bees moved over his hands without stinging, as though they knew him. He showed her how to smoke the hive gently, how to lift the frames without disturbing the comb too much, and when they were done, he gave her a jar of honey to take with her. "You do not have to keep giving me things," Fenna said, though she cradled the jar carefully. "I want to," Henry said simply. "And I have more than I can use. It makes me happy to share it." She left late that morning, promising to stop by again if she was in the area, and Henry walked her to the edge of the orchard, his hands in his pockets and his expression warm. "I hope you will," he said. "It was good to see you again." "It was good to see you too," Fenna said, and she meant it more than she expected. She visited twice more over the following month, each time staying a little longer, and each time the conversation came a little easier, the silences a little more comfortable. Henry told her about his childhood, about growing up on the estate with his older sister Helena, who had been groomed to inherit while he was expected to support her. He told her about the pressure, the expectations, the way his father had chosen a bride for him without asking what he wanted. Fenna told him about her clan, about leaving to see the world, about the freedom and the loneliness that came with always being on the move. "Do you ever think about going back?" Henry asked one evening as they sat on the porch, watching the stars come out. "To my clan," Fenna considered. "Sometimes, but I do not think I would stay. I have changed too much. I do not fit there anymore." "I feel the same way about the estate," Henry said. I do not think I could go back even if they asked me to. Too much has happened. I am not the person they wanted me to be." "Maybe that is a good thing," Fenna said softly. "Maybe being who we are is better than being who they wanted." Henry looked at her, and in the dim light his expression was unreadable. "I think you are right." It was on her fourth visit, as autumn deepened and the first frosts touched the mornings, that Henry asked her to stay longer. They were in the orchard picking apples to press for cider, and Fenna was up on a ladder, reaching for a particularly large fruit that hung just out of reach. Henry stood below, holding the basket, and when she climbed down with the apple in hand, he spoke. "I have been thinking," he said, not quite meeting her eyes. "You said you are looking for work and winter is coming. The roads will be hard soon and jobs will be scarce. I could use help with the harvest and with preparing the hives for winter. If you wanted to stay for a few weeks, I could pay you, and you would have a warm place to sleep and food to eat." Fenna set the apple in the basket, her heart beating a little faster. "You want me to stay?" "I do," Henry said, and now he did meet her eyes, his gaze steady. "I like having you here, Fenna. You work hard and you are good company, and I think we get along well, but only if you want to. I do not want to pressure you." She thought about the roads, about the long, cold months ahead, about the uncertainty of finding work and shelter in the winter. But more than that, she thought about the cottage, about the warmth of the fire and the taste of fresh bread, about the way Henry listened when she spoke, and the way his smile made her feel like she mattered. "I would like that," she said, "if you are sure." "I am sure," Henry said, and his smile was brighter than the autumn sun, so Fenna stayed. She moved her things into the loft, and over the following weeks they fell into a rhythm. She helped Henry with the harvest, picking apples and pressing cider, preparing the hives for winter by wrapping them in straw and checking the stores of honey. She learned the names of the different apple varieties, learned how to tell when the cider was ready, learned the patterns of the bees and the way the orchard changed as the days grew shorter. Henry taught her how to bake bread, how to make preserves, how to mend the wax foundation in the hive frames. They worked side by side, and when the work was done, they sat by the fire and talked, or read from the small collection of books Henry kept on a shelf, or simply enjoyed the quiet. It was easy, being with him. Easier than Fenna had expected. There were no grand gestures, no dramatic declarations, just the steady accumulation of shared moments, of conversations that stretched late into the night, of laughter over small mishaps and comfortable silences that needed no filling. She found herself watching him when he was not looking, noticing the way his hands moved with such care when he handled the bees, the way he hummed softly to himself when he kneaded bread, the way his eyes softened when he looked at her. And she thought, with a mixture of wonder and uncertainty, that she might be falling in love with him. It was late autumn, the leaves gone from the trees and the air sharp with the promise of winter, when the letter arrived. Fenna was in the orchard, checking the last of the hives, when she heard the sound of hoofbeats on the road. She looked up to see a man on horseback, well dressed in a long coat and polished boots, and he reined in at the cottage, dismounting with the ease of someone used to riding. Henry came out onto the porch, wiping his hands on a cloth, and his expression shifted from curiosity to something more guarded when he saw the rider. Fenna walked back toward the cottage, arriving in time to hear the man say, "I have a letter for you, Henry Oakes, from your sister." Henry took the letter, his face unreadable, and the man tipped his hat and rode away without another word. Fenna climbed the porch steps, and Henry looked at her, the envelope in his hand. "My sister," he said quietly. "I have not heard from her in 4 years. You want to read it alone?" Fenna asked. Henry shook his head. "No, stay, please. They went inside, and Henry sat at the table, breaking the seal and unfolding the letter. Fenna sat across from him, watching the way his eyes moved over the words, the way his expression shifted from surprise to something more complex. When he finished, he set the letter down and stared at it for a long moment. "What does it say?" Fenna asked gently. "Helena wants me to come back," Henry said, his voice rough. "My father died 3 months ago. She inherited the estate, but she says it is too much for her to manage alone. She wants me to come home to help her run it. She is offering me a share of the inheritance if I return." Fenna felt her stomach twist. "What will you do?" Henry looked up at her, his eyes troubled. "I do not know. I left because I did not want that life, but Helena and I were close once. I did not leave because of her, and if she needs help, I do not know if I can just ignore that." "You should do what feels right," Fenna said, though the words hurt to say. "But what if I do not know what that is?" Henry asked, and there was a vulnerability in his voice that made her chest ache. "Then maybe you need time to figure it out," Fenna said. "You do not have to decide right now." Henry nodded, but she could see the weight of it settling on him, and she knew that the easy rhythm they had built was about to be disrupted. Over the following days, Henry was quieter, more distant, and Fenna felt the space between them growing. He read the letter multiple times, staring at it as though the words might change if he looked long enough. Fenna did not push, but she watched him struggle, and she felt helpless to ease it. One evening, as they sat by the fire, Henry spoke. "I wrote back to Helena. I told her I needed time to think, but that I would consider it." Fenna nodded, her throat tight. "That seems fair." "She wrote back," Henry continued. "She said she understands, but she asked if I would at least come visit so we could talk in person. She wants me to see the estate again, to see what it would mean to come back." "Are you going to go?" "I think I should," Henry said. He looked at her then, his eyes searching. "But I do not want to go alone. Fenna, would you come with me?" Fenna stared at him, surprised. "You want me to come with you, to your family estate?" "Yes," Henry said. "I do not know what I will find there, and I do not know what I will decide. But I know that I trust you, and I value your perspective. If you are willing, I would like you to be there." Fenna thought about it, about what it would mean to step into that world, to stand beside him in a place where she would be even more of an outsider than usual. But she thought about the way he had asked, the openness in his voice, and she found herself nodding. "All right, I will come with you." Relief washed over his face, and he reached across the space between them, taking her hand in his. "Thank you." They left a week later, after making arrangements for a neighbor to check on the hives and the cottage. The journey took 2 days by wagon, the road winding through valleys and over hills, and Fenna watched the landscape change from the wild foothills to the more cultivated lands of the southern valley. The estate appeared on the second afternoon, a sprawling manor house of stone and timber, surrounded by fields and orchards far larger than Henry's small plot. It was impressive, grand in a way that made Fenna feel small, and she saw the way Henry's jaw tightened as they approached. A woman was waiting on the front steps, tall and elegant, with brown hair pinned up in an intricate style and a dress of deep blue that spoke of wealth. She stepped forward as Henry pulled the wagon to a stop, and her face broke into a smile that was both joyful and relieved. "Henry," she said, and there was emotion thick in her voice. "Helena," Henry said, climbing down from the wagon. He turned to help Fenna down, and Helena's gaze shifted to her, surprise flickering across her face before she smoothed it away. "This is Fenna Larek," Henry said, his hand still on Fenna's elbow. "She is a friend. She is staying with me for the winter, helping with the orchard. I asked her to come with me." Helena's smile was polite, but Fenna saw the curiosity in her eyes. "It is a pleasure to meet you, Miss Larek. Welcome to Oaks Manor." "Thank you," Fenna said, inclining her head. Helena led them inside, and Fenna tried not to stare at the grandeur of it, the high ceilings and polished floors, the portraits lining the walls. They were shown to guest rooms, and Helena promised to meet them for dinner in an hour, giving them time to rest and freshen up. Fenna stood in the center of her room, which was larger than the entire ground floor of Henry's cottage, and felt profoundly out of place. She washed her face and changed into the cleanest clothes she had, and when there was a knock on the door, she opened it to find Henry standing there, looking as uncomfortable as she felt. "This is strange," he said without preamble. "Very," Fenna agreed. "I am glad you are here," Henry said. "I do not think I could do this alone." "You could," Fenna said gently, "but I am glad to be here anyway." Dinner was an elaborate affair, served in a dining room with a table that could have seated 20. It was just the three of them, and the food was rich and plentiful, but Fenna found it hard to enjoy. Helena asked polite questions about Fenna's work, about how she and Henry had met, and Fenna answered as honestly as she could, aware of the way Helena's gaze lingered on her tusks, on her green skin. But there was no hostility in it, only curiosity, and Fenna found herself cautiously liking the woman. After the meal, Helena and Henry withdrew to the study to talk, and Fenna was left to wander the manor. She found herself in the library, a room lined floor to ceiling with books, and she ran her fingers along the spines, marveling at the collection. She was still there when Henry found her an hour later, his expression drawn. "How did it go?" Fenna asked. Henry sank into a chair, rubbing his face. "She wants me to stay. Not just visit, but stay. She says the estate is thriving, but it is too much for her to manage alone, and she needs someone she can trust. She is offering me a full partnership, a share of the profits, and a place here. She says I could have my own wing of the house, my own space, that I would not have to give up who I am." "What did you say?" "I told her I needed to think about it," Henry said. "But she pressed. She said she would give me until the end of the week to decide." Fenna sat down across from him, her heart heavy. "Do you want to stay?" Henry looked at her, and there was anguish in his eyes. "I do not know. Part of me wants to help her, to rebuild the relationship we had, but another part of me does not want to give up what I have built. The cottage, the orchard, the life I have made, it feels like choosing one means losing the other." "Maybe it does not have to be that way," Fenna said quietly. "Maybe there is a middle ground." "I do not see how," Henry said. "Helena needs me here, not visiting once in a while. And the estate requires constant attention. I could not split my time between here and the cottage without neglecting both." Fenna did not have an answer for that, and they sat in silence, the weight of the decision pressing down on them both. Over the following days, Helena showed Henry around the estate, pointing out all the work that needed to be done, the opportunities for growth, the ways he could make a difference. Fenna accompanied them sometimes, but more often she stayed back, exploring the grounds or sitting in the library. She saw the way Helena looked at her brother, the hope and the love there, and she understood why Henry was torn. Helena was not demanding or manipulative. She genuinely needed him, and she believed that this was the best path for them both. But Fenna also saw the way Henry grew quieter as the days passed, the way the light in his eyes dimmed. He was polite, engaged, but there was a tension in him that had not been there at the cottage, a sense of being pulled in a direction he was not sure he wanted to go. On the fourth evening, Fenna found him standing on the terrace, looking out over the fields. She joined him, and they stood side by side in the gathering dusk. "What are you thinking?" she asked softly. "I am thinking that this place is beautiful," Henry said. "And that my sister is trying so hard to make me see it as home. But it does not feel like home, Fenna. It feels like a place I used to know, but I do not belong here anymore." "Then do not stay," Fenna said, the words simple and direct. Henry turned to her, surprise in his eyes. But Helena needs me. She needs someone, Fenna corrected gently. And that someone does not have to be you. You could help her find a steward, a manager, someone who wants this life. But if you stay out of obligation, if you give up what you love because you feel guilty, you will resent it eventually, and that will poison everything, including your relationship with her. Henry stared at her, and she saw the moment the truth of it settled into him. You are right, he said quietly. I know you are right, but I do not know how to tell her that. Tell her the truth, Fenna said. Tell her you love her, but that this is not your life. She will understand or she will not, but at least you will have been honest. Henry nodded slowly, and then he reached out and took her hand, his fingers threading through hers. Thank you, Fenna, for coming with me, for helping me see clearly. Always, Fenna said, and she meant it. The next morning, Henry sat down with Helena in the study and told her that he could not stay. Fenna waited outside, pacing the hallway, and when the door finally opened, both siblings emerged with red-rimmed eyes but expressions that were calm rather than angry. Helena looked at Fenna, and there was understanding in her gaze. He loves you, you know. Fenna blinked, startled, but Helena smiled. I can see it in the way he looks at you, and I think you love him too. She turned back to Henry. Go back to your orchard, little brother. Build the life you want, but do not be a stranger. Write to me. Visit when you can. I do not want to lose you again. You will not, Henry promised, pulling her into a hug. I will write, and you are welcome at the cottage any time. Helena laughed through her tears. I will hold you to that. They left that afternoon, the wagon loaded with supplies Helena had insisted they take. And as the manor disappeared behind them, Fenna saw the tension drain from Henry's shoulders. He looked at her, and there was something new in his gaze, something open and unguarded. Fenna, he said, his voice steady. Helena was right. I do love you. Fenna's breath caught, and she stared at him, her heart pounding. Henry. I know this is sudden, he said quickly, and I do not expect you to feel the same way, but I needed you to know. These past months, having you at the cottage, working beside you, talking to you, it has been the happiest I have ever been. And when I was trying to decide whether to stay at the estate, the only thing that mattered was whether I could come back to you. Fenna felt tears prick her eyes, and she reached out, taking his hand. I love you too, she said, her voice shaking. I did not realize how much until I thought I might lose you to that place. But I do, Henry. I love you. He pulled the wagon to a stop, and then he was off the bench and pulling her down beside him, his hands cupping her face as he looked at her with such tenderness that it made her chest ache. Will you stay? He asked. Not just for the winter, but for as long as you want. Will you make the cottage your home? Yes, Fenna said, and then she was kissing him, and he was kissing her back, and the world narrowed to just the two of them, standing on the side of the road as the sun set behind them. They returned to the cottage as the first snow began to fall, and it felt like coming home in a way Fenna had never experienced before. They unloaded the wagon together, laughing as the snow dusted their hair and shoulders, and that night they sat by the fire, Henry's arm around her and her head on his shoulder, and talked about the future. I want to expand the orchard, Henry said. Plant more trees, maybe add a few more hives. And I want to build a proper workshop for the carpentry I have been meaning to learn. What do you want? I want to stay here with you, Fenna said simply. I want to help you build all of that, and maybe someday I want to have a family with you, if you want that too. I do, Henry said, his voice thick with emotion. I want all of that. Winter passed slowly, the days short and the nights long, but the cottage was warm and full of laughter. They worked together on small projects, repairing tools and planning for the spring, and they spent the evenings reading or talking or simply being together. Fenna learned to bake pies, and Henry taught her to carve wood, and they fell asleep each night in each other's arms, the world outside forgotten. Spring came with a rush of green and the return of the bees, and they threw themselves into the work of the orchard and the hives. Fenna proved to be a quick learner, her strength and patience making her invaluable, and Henry often stopped in the middle of a task just to watch her, marveling at how seamlessly she had become part of his life. In late spring, Helena visited, arriving in a carriage with gifts and news. She had hired a steward, a capable man who had already begun to improve the estate's efficiency, and she was happier than Henry had seen her in years. She stayed for 3 days, charming Fenna with stories of Henry's childhood and insisting on helping with the hive inspections despite her fine clothes. On the last evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, she looked at her brother and said, "You made the right choice, Henry." "I can see that now." "Thank you," Henry said, "and thank you for understanding." "You are happy," Helena said simply. "That is all I ever wanted for you." After she left, Henry pulled Fenna aside and showed her the ring, the one she had returned to him all those months ago. "I want you to have this," he said. Fenna stared at it. "Henry, that is your family ring." "And you are my family now," Henry said. "I know it is not a traditional proposal, and I know we have not talked about marriage yet, but I want you to have it as a promise. A promise that you are home, that you belong here, and that I will spend the rest of my life making sure you know it." Fenna took the ring, her hands trembling, and slipped it onto her finger. It fit perfectly, the worn crest catching the light, and she looked up at him with tears in her eyes. "Yes," she said, "to all of it. Yes." They were married in the summer, a simple ceremony in the orchard with Helena and a few neighbors as witnesses. Fenna wore a dress Helena had commissioned for her, soft green linen that complemented her skin, and Henry wore his best shirt and trousers, the ring back on his own finger, a match to the one Fenna now wore. They exchanged vows under the apple trees, promising to love and support each other, to build a life together, and when the officiant pronounced them married, Henry kissed her with such joy that the small gathering broke into applause. The harvest that year was abundant, and they celebrated with a supper at the long table Henry had built on the porch, wide enough to seat a dozen people. Helena came, bringing wine from the estate, and the neighbors brought dishes to share, and they ate and drank and laughed as the sun set and the stars came out. Fenna looked around the table at the faces of people who had become friends, at Henry beside her, his hand warm in hers, and felt a deep, abiding contentment. "What are you thinking?" Henry asked quietly, leaning close so only she could hear. "I am thinking that I never imagined this," Fenna said. "A home, a family, a place where I belong, and I am thinking that I am the luckiest woman alive." "I am the lucky one," Henry said, kissing her temple. "You walked into my life with a ring and a kind heart, and you changed everything." "We changed everything," Fenna corrected. "Together." Autumn came again, the cycle completing, and they pressed cider and collected honey and prepared for another winter. But this time, there was a new purpose to their preparations, because Fenna was pregnant, and they were getting ready to welcome a child into the world. The baby was born in the early spring, a daughter with green skin a shade lighter than Fenna's, tiny tusks barely visible, and hazel eyes that looked up at them with solemn curiosity. They named her Ivy, after the plant that grew wild around the cottage, strong and resilient and beautiful. Henry held her with such tenderness, such awe, that Fenna felt her heart overflow. "She is perfect," he whispered. "She is ours," Fenna said, wrapping her arm around him as they stood together, looking down at their daughter. Helena visited a month later, bringing gifts and cooing over her niece, and she stayed for a week, helping Fenna navigate the exhaustion and joy of new motherhood. "She is beautiful," Helena said, rocking Ivy gently. "And she is going to grow up knowing she is loved. That is all that matters." As Ivy grew, the cottage filled with the sounds of her laughter, her curious questions, her delight at the bees and the apples and the world around her. She was a bright, bold child, fearless in the way only the deeply loved can be, and she grew up running through the orchard with her parents, learning to tend the hives and help with the harvest. Years passed, marked by the turning of the seasons and the steady accumulation of shared moments. The orchard expanded, just as Henry had dreamed, and the honey from his hives became known throughout the valley. Fenna's strength and skill made her indispensable, and she became a respected figure in the community, her initial otherness giving way to admiration and affection. They had another child, a son they named Ash, and then a daughter they named Willow, and the cottage that had once been so quiet was filled with the noise and chaos and love of a growing family. Helena married a kind man from a neighboring estate, and she and Henry rebuilt their relationship into something stronger than it had been before, forged not by obligation, but by choice. She visited often, her own children playing with their cousins in the orchard, and the two families grew close, bound by blood and by the love that had brought them back together. On a warm autumn evening, as the sun set over the orchard and the bees settled into their hives for the night, Fenna and Henry sat on the porch, watching their children play. Ivy was 12 now, tall and strong, helping her younger siblings climb the apple trees. Ash was 9, serious and thoughtful, his father's son in every way. Willow was 6, bright and curious, already declaring that she wanted to be a beekeeper like her father. Henry reached over and took Fenna's hand, the ring on her finger catching the fading light. "Do you remember the day you brought me the ring, of course?" Fenna said, smiling. "I walked for days to return it, and you asked me to stay for dinner." "Best decision I ever made," Henry said, his voice warm, "asking you to stay." "Best decision I ever made," Fenna replied, was saying yes. They sat in comfortable silence, the years stretching behind them and ahead, and Fenna thought about the long road that had brought her here, about the ring that had started it all, about the quiet man who had seen her not as an orc or an outsider, but as a person worth knowing. She thought about the life they had built, the family they had created, the love that had grown from a simple act of kindness into something deep and enduring. "Thank you," Henry said softly, and when she looked at him, his eyes were full of everything they had shared, everything they had become. "For what?" "For coming back," he said. "For staying, for choosing this life with me." Fenna leaned over and kissed him, the taste of apples and honey on his lips, the warmth of the setting sun on their faces. "Always," she said. "For as long as we both live, I will choose you." And as their children's laughter rang out across the orchard, as the bees hummed their evening song and the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Fenna knew with absolute certainty that she had found exactly what she had been searching for all those years ago, when she picked up a lost ring on a mountain trail. She had found home, not in a place, but in the man beside her, in the family they had made, in the life they had built together from a single shared meal and a simple question: "Would you stay for dinner?" Yes, she thought, watching Henry smile at their children, watching the life they had created unfold before them in all its messy, beautiful, perfect reality. "Yes, I will stay, for dinner and for every meal after. For every season, every harvest, every moment, I will stay." The harvest supper that year was the largest they had ever hosted. The table on the porch extended with boards and sawhorses to accommodate everyone. Helena and her family came, as well as neighbors from the surrounding farms, friends they had made over the years, and even a few orcs who had heard of Fenna and Henry, and wanted to see for themselves the life they had built. The table groaned under the weight of the food: roasted meats and fresh bread, pies made from their own apples, and jar after jar of honey in shades from pale gold to dark amber. Fenna stood at one end of the table, Henry at the other, and they raised their cups in a toast. "To family," Fenna said, her voice carrying over the gathered crowd. "To friends, to the harvest, and to the life we share." "To home," Henry added, his eyes on Fenna, and everyone drank, the sound of their voices rising in agreement. As the evening deepened and the lanterns were lit, as the children ran between the tables and the adults settled into easy conversation, Fenna found herself standing a little apart, watching it all. Henry appeared beside her, slipping his arm around her waist, and she leaned into him, content. "This is everything I ever wanted," she said quietly. "Everything I never knew I could have." "Me too," Henry said, pressing a kiss to her hair. "And it all started because you walked a long way to return something that belonged to me." Fenna looked down at the ring on her finger, the crest worn smooth by years of wear, and smiled. "I think it was always meant to find its way back to you, and I think I was always meant to be the one to bring it." "I think you are right," Henry said. "And I think we were always meant to find each other." They stood together in the warm glow of the lanterns, surrounded by the people they loved, in the place they had made their own, and Fenna knew that this was the story she would carry with her for the rest of her life. Not the story of an orc woman who returned a lost ring, but the story of two people who found each other in the most unexpected way, who chose to build something beautiful together, who proved that love could flourish anywhere, as long as there was honesty, kindness, and the willingness to stay. The night deepened, the stars wheeling overhead, and the harvest supper continued, a celebration of everything they had grown and gathered, everything they had become. And at the center of it all was the table where Henry had first asked Fenna to stay for dinner, the table that had become the heart of their home, the place where their life together had truly begun. It was a table set for a life, and it was full.